welcome to our third class on Jesus and his parables. Today we will look at the parable of the friend at midnight, a parable that is sometimes misunderstood in the West because we are unfamiliar with some aspects of everyday life in the Middle East. Let's begin with a little background. This parable is found right after Jesus teaches his disciples the Lord's Prayer. The setting in Luke is different from the one we find in Matthew, where Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew, Jesus warns against praying just to be seen as super religious or piling up words in an attempt to manipulate God. In Matthew, Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer as a guideline for prayer. The setting in Luke is different. Here, the disciples see Jesus praying and want him to teach them how to pray, just like John the Baptist taught his own followers. So Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, followed by a parable to encourage his disciples to pray. Let's turn to the text. I'd encourage you to download the handout of the text found on the class website and follow along. Notice the structure of the parable. There are two sections, one that talks about what will not happen, and the second about what will happen. The theme of giving is seen throughout the text. Let's look at a few interesting details. In the desert areas of Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, a person needs to travel at night because of the heat. But in Palestine and Lebanon, there are cool sea breezes that blow, making travel during the daytime possible. So it's unusual for a friend to arrive at midnight, and it poses a challenge for the host. The host must feed his guest, whether the guest is hungry or not, and the guest must eat, whether they are hungry or not. This is part of the expectations of hospitality in the Middle East. A meal consisted of bread and other dishes, with the bread functioning as the fork or spoon. A person would tear off a small piece of bread and use the piece to scoop up the food, which was served in a communal dish. Now you can see the problem if the host didn't have any bread, and don't even think about using leftovers. So Jesus opens the parable by asking a question that in the Middle East would obviously be answered as, no, that would never happen. In a nutshell, Jesus asks his disciples, you have a friend that arrives just before midnight and you need to provide a meal, but you don't have food to set before him. So you go to your neighbor to ask for bread and you get ridiculous excuses about a locked door and sleeping kids. Can you imagine? The answer Jesus expected was, you've got to be kidding. We in the West tend to misunderstand this parable because of a mistranslation. The translation from Dr. Ken Bailey that I provided on the class website captures the correct meaning of Jesus' question. The responsibility for a guest in the Middle East is legendary. Jesus' audience would never offer excuses when proper hospitality was at stake. This would shame the person making the excuses. Remember, the culture in the Middle East during biblical times, as well as today, is what is called a shame-honor culture. This is different from our culture here in the West, which is driven more by guilt. In the Middle East, shame and honor are linked to maintaining a good reputation in the community. Some areas of life in the Middle East are governed by laws, but much of a person's behavior is regulated by the emotions of shame and honor. Now, when we read the text, we often have this visual in our heads. The host goes over his neighbor's house, knocks on the door, the neighbor ignores the host, hoping he'll go the way, so the host keeps on knocking until the neighbor tells him to go the way. But read the text closely. The host never knocks. Jesus tells his audience the host goes to his neighbor and says to him. In the Middle East, a stranger knocks on the door. A friend calls to his neighbor because his neighbor will recognize his voice and not be frightened. Now, the neighbor offers excuses for not helping his friend. These are weak excuses, and Jesus' audience knows that. The bolt on the door isn't heavy, it's easily opened, and even if the kids do wake up, they'll go back to sleep again. Children in Jesus' time were not the center of their parents' lives, as they can be sometimes in our own culture. The audience recognizes the excuses are so bad that they're comical, and would have elicited more than one guffaw when Jesus told the story. You see, the guest who came to visit caused an emergency for the host. It's as though the host's house is on fire, so he ran to the neighbors to use their phone. No neighbor would refuse the use of their phone to call the fire department. Also, when the host is standing outside in the street talking to his neighbor, the rest of the neighborhood hears what's going on. If the neighbor says no to his friend, the whole village will know, and they will shame him the next morning and the days to come. In this culture, the community is more important than any individual. Unlike our culture, where the rights of the individual trump the good of the community, in the Middle East, the good of the whole community is more important than any one individual. Now, you may ask, well, how does the host know his neighbor even has bread? In Palestinian villages, women bake bread at the communal oven, baking enough bread at one time to last a week or longer, so everyone knows who's just baked bread. Even though the host asks for only bread, we realize he needs the rest of the meal too. Look at verse 8. The neighbor gives the host whatever he needs, the best tray, the best water pitcher, the best tablecloth, the best goblets. It's really a situation of ask for an inch, take a mile. I'm reminded of the children's book, if you give a mouse a cookie, he'll ask for a glass of milk. Let's summarize the situation to this point. The host went to his one friend in order to honor a second friend. He's not asking for anything for himself. He's simply asking for basic food to set before an unexpected guest. This parable is traditionally understood in the West as a host persistent in knocking until his neighbor finally gives in. The emphasis on persistence is made in other parables, but isn't the focus of this one. Instead, the word that is often translated to the English word persistence is a Greek word that means having a sense of shame. This word refers to a person being indifferent to what is proper behavior and being thoughtless or inconsiderate. This sense of shame refers to the neighbor who refuses to help when asked. The phrase, I have nothing to set before him, is an idiom that means I have nothing adequate to serve, so the honor of our village is maintained. The appeal to the community is the main point. We must understand that in this culture, a guest is the guest of the whole community, not just the individual in the story. This is revealed in the language used in the Middle East, even today. A guest is often greeted by the phrase, you have honored our village by your visit, not you have honored me by your visit. Since the community is considered to be responsible for hosting and entertaining guests, borrowing items developed into a fine art, it's common to ask multiple neighbors to provide different parts of a meal, as long as each ask isn't too big. You'd ask many neighbors to provide something small rather than to ask one neighbor to provide the majority of the things you needed. When you know a person is gathering a little bit from everyone in the village, anyone who refused to contribute would be considered stingy and their reputation would suffer. If the request is modest, refusal is unthinkable. The neighbor wants to maintain his reputation, so he must act in order to do that. As the audience listened to the parable, they would have also imagined the next morning when the whole village turned out to bid the guest farewell. In the end, everyone's reputation stayed intact. The village honored their obligation of hospitality, the host entertained his unexpected guest very well, and the neighbor's good name is enhanced since he supplied everything the host needed. In this parable, Jesus teaches that the host gets everything he needs, even when the circumstances seem to be against him. Now, the meaning of the parable is clear. Because God is a God of integrity and honor, he will answer your prayers, even when it seems like everything in life is stacked against you. Plus, God loves you, so how much more will he be willing to answer your prayer? The text now moves into a beautiful poem of a father telling his son to ask, seek, and knock. One thing to note in the first part of the poem is that the Greek verb Jesus used is one that implies continuing action. You should keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. Jesus is emphasizing that everyone can ask, seek, and knock, including those who are treated as outcasts in the society. Jesus is breaking down walls again. He's declaring to the Pharisees, everyone who asks receives, even if they are sinners. It's just not the so-called righteous people who get their prayers answered. The next section is best understood as a separate parable with 3 comparisons. The contrasts make a little more sense when you understand that bread, fish, and eggs were the ordinary food of the common people. Now, a round loaf of bread can look like a stone, so that comparison is pretty easy to visualize. In previous centuries, a catfish type of fish lived in the Sea of Galilee. It could grow to 5 feet, breathe air, and crawl on land, looking like a snake. It was considered unclean, so if it was caught in a fishing net, it would be thrown back into the water and not eaten. Finally, a scorpion, when it was all folded up, could be mistaken for an egg. All three images convey the same message. A son will always receive gifts from his father that are good gifts, not gifts that are harmful. The final verse reiterates that if a human parent knows how to give good gifts to their children, how much more will our loving God give good gifts to all who ask him? In this narrative, Jesus begins by teaching his disciples to pray with the Lord's Prayer. He then encourages them to pray. Because God is a God of integrity, he will answer their prayers, even giving them more than they ask for. Finally, all the gifts God gives to his children are good gifts. To summarize this parable, even when it feels like circumstances are against you, you can go to your honorable neighbor and be assured that you will receive more than you ask for. So how much more can you be assured God answers prayer? He won't violate his character. Plus, he loves you. Jesus promises our prayers are heard and that God gives only good gifts. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we will look at the parable of the rich fool. So please read Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21 to prepare. Until then, keep the faith.